Many people feel that being a Christian is about the most boring life anyone could ever have. Seriously, that's what a lot of people think. Because after all, God does have requirements on our lives. And so let me raise the question, can Christians be happy, even Christians? Well, that's an issue we're going to talk about in this session. Do you think these contradict this idea of enjoying life and then also fearing God? In the eyes of many people, these are quite contradictory. But I think as we will delve into the book we're going to look at in this session, the book of Ecclesiastes, we'll see that they're not antithetical after all at all. Ecclesiastes is our current series right now, and a lot of it talks about a king's ambition. Who that king was is debated quite a bit today. He is not mentioned by name in the book. The name is actually Kohelet, the preacher, or some translations call it the teacher. You'll see it in the very second verse of the book, or the very first verse of the book. The words of the teacher, the New International Version says. So who was this teacher? Some say, well, this can't be Solomon, even though it says son of David, because the word Solomon is not used. And I have to admit that they're correct. Others will add that so-called later words are used in this book. Words that were not used during the time of Solomon. They didn't come into use till hundreds of years after Solomon. And then he does say in chapter 1, verse 12, he says, I, the teacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. Notice how he uses the past tense. I was king. In other words, the way this theory goes, the assumption is he's not king anymore. And if he's not king anymore, then it couldn't have been Solomon, because Solomon remained king until his death. Of course, I would also ask, well, what other king did not remain king until his death? We have to have some clear understanding about this. And are these really later words? Other scholars who have looked at these certain words used in the book have found that not only were they used at Solomon's time, but they're actually predating Solomon. And it is true, the word Solomon is not used, but we also have many other books of Scripture that do not claim authorship by a certain person, but the tradition and the understanding is that that person is used. That person is actually the author. Befitting Solomon are several factors in the book. He says that he was a man of great wisdom. Verse 16, look, I have grown and increased in wisdom more than anyone who's ruled in Jerusalem before me. This is also one of the verses they used against Solomon. Oh, these are people who have ruled in Jerusalem before him. And we know, of course, that only David ruled in Jerusalem before Solomon, at least for Israel's kings. But there were a history of kings for hundreds and hundreds of years in Jerusalem before Solomon. They just weren't Israelite kings. We see him involved in huge building projects, characteristic of Solomon, with many slaves and great wealth, with a harem, and a man who spoke many proverbs when we get to the end of the book. All of these make complete sense when we apply this book as the Jewish tradition has been for thousands of years, is actually being written by Solomon. But let's get beyond that. Let's talk about when this would have been written, assuming that it is written by Solomon. What point in his life was it written? We have Song of Songs, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes appearing in our Old Testament, but they actually have a different idea of Solomon in each one of these. In Song of Songs, or Song of Solomon, we see Solomon the lover. And I take it, as I noted in that session, that this was written by Solomon in his youth. before, his concepts of love and marriage and sex and women were corrupted later on in his life. We're studying Proverbs second in terms of the books written by Solomon, because I believe Proverbs was written in midlife when Solomon hit his prime. He was at his height when he quoted over 3,000 Proverbs, and he demonstrated great wisdom for him to be able to ask God for wisdom above all else. And then we have Ecclesiastes. My theory here is perhaps Ecclesiastes is depicting Solomon the foolish. He admits to being a fool. He admits to having profitless pursuits in this book. And part of the reason for him writing this book is to say, look at all the miserable things I did, all the miserable priorities I have. I hope you can learn from my mistakes in my old age so that you don't have to commit those mistakes yourself. But back to our question. Enjoy life or fear God? Frankly, we will find that this book tells us to do both. And the two are not contradictory to one another at all. And so this is the guiding question that I want to answer, that I think Solomon asks and Solomon answers in his book. There are several places in the book where he tells us to enjoy life. There are several places where he tells us to fear God. And yet, in the midst of all that, there are many perplexities in life, and there are numerous things that Solomon himself struggled with. So, what can we learn from him? Why should we do both? Why should we both enjoy life, and why should we both fear God, handling both of those? You should do both, first of all, because life is fleeting. Life doesn't last long. Even the oldest people don't live very long. Even a century is not very long in terms of human history. Life goes by very quickly. And so if it's going to go by quickly, enjoy life and fear God. The way I outline the book is in a fourfold division. So we're actually going to look at four answers to this question: why should we do both? And those four sections each of them will give us one principle or one teaching from what Solomon says in this book that will help us to know how to balance life in terms of enjoying this life that God has given us, as well as at the same time honoring and revering the God who gave this life to us in the first place. So that's our overview. In the first 11 verses, we see the theme actually talked about, the fleeting nature of man's humanity and all the cycles of man's life. And then it's going to finally end in terms of what he has to say about youth at the very end. Well, let's go to the beginning. In the first 11 verses, Solomon depicts life as going in circles. It goes in circles partly because people are just going so fast. I find very few people ever tell me, oh, my life is just too slow. You ever hear anybody say that? I hear 10 people or more, 100 people say my life is too fast compared to those that would say it was too slow. Kind of like rats. You know, a lot of people feel like they're just running in circles, like they're a rat on a little treadmill, or that we talk about climbing the ladder and, you know, getting to the top of the ladder and then finding out, well, you climb the ladder, but it's leaning against the wrong wall. Or some have said we're running the rat race. And you ever feel that way? You ever feel like you are running the rat race? And what if you win? What if you win the rat race? Well, you're still a rat. It doesn't change who you actually are. It just means you're a faster rat than the other rats. And honestly, what good is all that? Now, I know we have our excuses, and some of us say, well, yeah, but if you only knew my boss, you would know why I have to run so fast. But what Solomon says in this first section for us is every human endeavor is short-lived. He starts off by saying, well, as we have in the New International Version, meaningless, says the teacher. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. Or if you have King James Version, yours will say vanity, vanity, all is vanity. There's obviously a different understanding here of what is meant by this Hebrew word, havel. What does havel actually mean? This has been a real issue of debate, especially in recent scholarship on the book of Ecclesiastes. The various meanings start with vanity, which was the translation of the King James Version 4 centuries ago, and has been followed by the more recent English Standard Version and the New American Updated Version. Others translate it more like meaningless, such as the NIV and the New Living Translation. Some others, maybe more of a minority view, is the idea of futile, everything is futile. And yet, I think that even though all those might be encompassed in what the word means in various contexts, I think probably the best word to be used is this word fleeting. Fleeting. Life just goes by too quickly. And I think that's actually what he's saying in the book of Ecclesiastes. I have taught this book for many, many years. And to be honest, I've really struggled with it. If you look at my outline of the book that you'll find in the Old Testament survey or the Old Testament preaching links on my Bible Study Downloads website, you'll see that I've actually outlined the book all the way down to the verse level. It has the most detailed outline, I believe, of any outline I have in the Old Testament. And that's a reflection of how much I've struggled with actually what Solomon's saying here. And what I used to teach about this book is that it talked about two different ways of life, as if sometimes Solomon's under the water, and other times he's above water. And he's looking at life from two different standpoints. The word meaningless would indicate this. He says life is meaningless because he's only seeing life from a horizontal perspective. In other words, he's only seeing life under the sun. He's not really seeing God's perspective. And when you don't see God's perspective on life, life is meaningless. Theologically, that is actually a true point. The question is that what Solomon is saying? So I used to think that meaningless was really the best translation of havel, and then Solomon would write most of the book under the sun or talk about the meaninglessness of life, but then he would come up for air like all of us need to do when we're underwater. You can't stay underwater very long. You have to come up. And he'd come up for air and he'd say, but enjoy life. Even though it's all meaningless, enjoy life. And then sometimes in the book he would say, and fear God. And finally, when you get to the very last few verses of the book, he adds, keep his commandments. But then the book would be mostly Solomon going down underwater, looking at life from a human perspective, and then coming up for air and seeing the divine perspective and going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth as if, well, like Solomon was schizophrenic. I've, in recent years, changed my view of what I think Solomon is actually doing in this book. And instead of saying, as I used to say, that this book is about the meaninglessness of human achievement and wisdom, I began asking questions like, Is life really meaningless? Must it be meaningless? Was Solomon schizophrenic? Really? He was certainly disillusioned, but was he not consistent? Perhaps what we can do that will help is to go back to the literal meaning of the word havel. Havel literally means a breath, wind, or vapor. It's used in Proverbs 21:6 and Isaiah 57:13. And therefore, a very literal translation of verse 2 is this. Says the teacher. Everything is Now do you get it? Now, when I blow out air, am I blowing out nothing? Not really. I'm blowing out air, right? When I blow out air, am I blowing out something that is meaningless? It's not really meaningless. That air has served a function in my lungs and provided my life a few more moments of life. The metaphor actually talks about what doesn't last. It doesn't mean that it is meaningless. It just means it's not lasting. It means what is without real substance, without real value or permanence or significance or meaning, is the way the Bible Knowledge Commentary sums it up. And so if I asked you, what actually is wind or vapor like? You would say that wind or vapor is actually real, is it not? Even though you cannot see it. It's fleeting, though. It's transitory. The wind will come on through, and it just passes on by. It's not lasting. The wind just comes by momentarily and has to be followed by another wind. It has to be followed by repeated winds for it to really have effect. Sometimes havel, or wind or vapor, is talking about that which is enigmatic or perplexing. Enigmatic, it's an enigma to us. It's something we just cannot figure out. And so we are perplexed. We're wondering how we're supposed to actually interpret this perspective on life or whatever is happening with us. And sometimes the word will refer to that which is unseen or obscure, which was certainly the case of wind. Nobody has ever seen wind. You can only see the effects of it. And in that sense, it's a bit obscure. Maybe instead of just saying that I think havel means fleeting, I should give you some synonyms. What I think Solomon's actually talking about in this book is he's saying that the various things in life are passing. They're brief. And I think we all would have to agree with that. We'd have to say, even those who live the longest life is really temporary. It's momentary and transitory and short-lived. And so when Solomon says what he says in verse 2, I would translate it this way: fleeting, says the teacher, utterly fleeting. Everything is fleeting. In other words, nothing really lasts for a long time. Even the things that we enjoy as well as the things that we do not enjoy. And then he illustrates that fleeting nature of life through the many cycles that we see in life in verses 3 to 11. They're all passing. They're just quick cycles. So he asks this question in verse 3. What do people get for all their hard work under the sun? He's actually introducing the question here that he's answering in these verses. And I think what he's actually saying is they're not getting a lot. because these things just kind of come and go over and over in their lives. Our work ultimately brings us nowhere. And then he gives the proof that life's many fleeting repetitions bring no real change in life. And he illustrates it over and over with what we see in life that just happens again and again. The ceaseless cycles are evident in our generations. Generations come and generations go, but the earth remains forever. We all start with a fertilized egg and go to a fetus and a baby and a child, an adolescent, adult, old age, and we end up dust in the grave, just as Adam started with dust. That's the human life cycle. And these ceaseless cycles are evident in nature. It doesn't mean that they're meaningless. It just means that this repetitiveness happens quite quickly, and it's very transitory or fleeting or short-lived. The sun continually rises and then sets every day, and it happens pretty quickly. The wind blows in circles. The rivers and the seas cycle water endlessly. It's not bad that they do that, but it doesn't take very long for water in the ocean or a lake or the soil to evaporate up into the air and condense in the clouds and come down as precipitation and run off the mountains into streams or lakes or the ocean, and then end up having this cycle over and over again. In fact, he says at the end of this, or one of the key ideas here is, nothing under the sun is truly new. The things, the ideas, everything just sort of comes quickly, passes through, and that's the way it has been throughout history. I think the main idea of these first 11 verses is that life's short-lived and fleeting cycles should move us to seek God. When we live in a world where everything is fleeting, everything is temporary, does it not make us want to have a life based on that which is eternal? I think that's what Solomon is really trying to encourage us to do. So he's saying, don't get caught up in the race, rat race, or whatever you call it. Yes, we all have different things to do in our lives. These are responsibilities, and sometimes they just absolutely exhaust us. And yet, at the same time, we need to live with purpose. I like what Francis Chan says. Our greatest fear should not be failure, but succeeding in the things in life that really don't matter. Do you fear failure? Or do you fear succeeding in things that ultimately have no value? So, why should we do both? Why should we enjoy life and fear God? Well, first of all, because life is fleeting. Even the oldest people don't last very long. But in the next section of the book, he gives us another reason why we need to do this. Fear God as well as enjoy life. Not only is life fleeting, but work is fleeting. And the focal point of the end of chapter 1 and through the beginning part of chapter 6, work is fleeting means that every human endeavor doesn't really last very long. No matter what you do, it's not going to last very long. So the focus here in the second section on work takes us from focusing on man's humanity to man's hands. What we use our hands for to provide the food and the clothing and the shelter that all of us need. And here Solomon gets a bit more personal. He talks about his profitless pursuits in terms of his own work. When I think of Solomon, I think of a man like Howard Hughes, who lived in the 20th century as an American businessman, investor, aviator, aerospace engineer, filmmaker, and philanthropist. He was quite a gifted man. In fact, he was one of the wealthiest men in the world. He built the largest airplane ever to have been built. It was the H-4 Hercules II. It was actually humongous. And his life was just filled with all kinds of women, famous actresses that came in and out of his life. The very fact that he had so many different women was evidence that he really never found satisfaction in any real relationship either. His obsessive compulsive behavior especially plagued him in his later years, and he spent his last days at the Desert Inn in Las Vegas. He was so paranoid about anyone else that might be in the hotel, he ended up buying the entire hotel so that he would be able to be living in the hotel by himself. He refused to leave the hotel, and in 1967 he spent most of his days living alone, naked, in his penthouse watching movies. He watched one movie 150 times. You thought you watched some movies too many times, right? And he was practically unrecognizable. His hair, his beard, his fingernails grew long, his toenails grew long. He was a large man, a tall man, very tall man, 193 centimeters, 6'4", but he weighed barely 90 pounds. Even though he had, it's 41 kg for a very tall man. He had a lot of money. He had so much money he could have been very overweight. But he had this fixation on cleanliness, and so he actually used these tissue boxes as shoes. And everywhere he went, he cleaned with tissues, Kleenex tissues, to make sure that he wouldn't collect any germs and die young. Well, he died in 1976. And those who did the autopsy of his body, they had to resort to fingerprints in order to identify the body, because the x-rays revealed 5 broken off hypodermic needles in the flesh of his arms. He was a man who had the opportunity to do just about anything in life. He had more money than any of us could ever imagine. He had more opportunity than any of us could dream about. And yet he was involved in profitless pursuits. Ecclesiastes tells us some of these profitless pursuits that we should avoid. Solomon wanted to make sure that if we were able to have wisdom that he lacked, even as a man of great wisdom, that we would be able to go past what he did, not get caught up in the same things he got caught up in. He actually was the king of Israel's golden age. Israel's never had more money, larger borders than the time of Solomon. But he said, I devoted myself to search for understanding and explore by wisdom everything being done under heaven. And I soon discovered that God has dealt a tragic existence to the human race. What an interesting statement, huh? This is grief. This is fleeting. Because he said, I observed everything going on under the sun, and really, it's all meaningless, or we might say, fleeting, like chasing the wind. And he said, it's all profitless as well. What is wrong cannot be made right. What is missing cannot be recovered. Sounds a bit despairing, doesn't it? For this reason, some people believe that the book of Ecclesiastes should not be in our Bible. This is the belief of some of the ancient rabbis who say this book is just too pessimistic. It really shouldn't be in the Bible. I think they have a point that there's pessimism in the book, but they're also missing the many, many times in the book that it advises us to fear God, to enjoy life, and to keep His commandments. But Solomon is quite honest about 5 of the profitless pursuits under the sun. He says, for example, prudence doesn't satisfy. And he says, I have increased in wisdom and knowledge, but he still wasn't satisfied. He goes into chapter 2 and he says, pleasure doesn't satisfy. Oh, how many of us get caught up in pleasure. And we think that by pleasing our body, our sexual desires, our desires for food, and all other things, that we're really going to find some satisfaction in life. And yet, I don't know if anyone ever experienced more pleasure than Solomon did. We also see that he was involved in the biggest project of his day, building the temple with all of its gold and ornate stones. And I mean, no one had ever seen anything quite like that. But even building the temple itself was not satisfying to him. Possessions don't satisfy either, whatever those possessions might be. The more possessions we have, frankly, the more things we have to fix, insure, store, the more things we have that will rust and break, and eventually everything we buy, we end up throwing away. And Solomon had more possessions than anyone. And power does not satisfy either. Solomon says, so I became greater than all who had lived in Jerusalem before me, and my wisdom never failed me. And yet, power itself, as many others have demonstrated, does not make one truly happy. So these are some good words from him. He says, anything I wanted, I would take. I denied myself no pleasure, or even found great pleasure in hard work, a reward for all my labors. But as I looked at everything I had worked so hard to accomplish, it was all so meaningless. Like chasing the wind, there was nothing really worthwhile anywhere. Basically, he's saying our profits never, our pursuits never profit. If your pursuit is something other than God, you're going to find that you may be a rat climbing the ladder, but that ladder is leading nowhere. Havel means breath, wind, vapor, and that's what Solomon found in his life. That prudence and pleasure and projects and possessions and power, none of them really satisfied. Just like Howard Hughes experienced as a young man and also as an old man. Which raises a question for us. What will it take for you to be satisfied? I wonder if you've ever thought about that question or answered that question. Are you satisfied right now? And if you're not, what will it take for you to be satisfied? Is it realistic? Is it attainable? Is it actually God? If you have Him, you truly can find satisfaction. And we get into chapter 3. We're going to have to move our way pretty quickly through this. We find another very popular chapter of Ecclesiastes that talks about God's timing. And it says God's timing is perfect. He has the right time for every activity on this planet. The chapter begins, there's a time for everything, and a season for every activity under heaven. What might be some of those times, those right things? You see him mentioning them. A time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build. And he goes on about talking about the appropriateness of certain times when they're appropriate, other times they're not appropriate. The opposite is more appropriate. And he concludes this part saying that God's ways are perfect because there's a right time for doing everything, it's very appropriate for us to seek God's ways, because then we'll find the right time. Our best has limited success, but God does everything right. He asks the question, what do people really get for their hard work? I mean, most of us work all day, and we stay up late working. And yet when you look at it, well, Solomon said, I've seen the burden God has placed on all of us. And students can especially relate to this, sleeping while studying for their exam. I've seen the task which God has given the sons of men with which to occupy themselves. It seems quite futile. It seems quite fleeting and meaningless, doesn't it? But he says, yet God has made everything beautiful in its own time. The word for beautiful has the idea of appropriate or fitting. It doesn't mean everything is beautiful. The Hebrew word for beautiful literally has this idea of God giving value and God making things valuable in their own time. And so I think chapter 3 is really telling us, celebrate your ignorance of God's timing. We are people who go through life, this fleeting life, when sometimes things are appropriate, other times they're not appropriate. But God's ways are perfect, so how do we respond? We respond celebrating our ignorance. I know that may sound a bit strange, but the reality is all of us are ignorant of many, many things. And so his key ideas here are God's timing is perfect, his ways are perfect, and so enjoy life and fear God. Here's one of those times where he just encourages us when he gets to chapter 3, verse 12. I know there's nothing better for men than to be happy and to do good while they live, that everyone may eat and drink and find satisfaction in all his toil. This is the gift of God. I know that everything God does will endure forever. Nothing can be added to it. Nothing can be taken away from it. God does it so that men will revere him. Whatever is has already been, and whatever will be has been before, and God will call the past to account. In other words, enjoy life, but you will live in a way that you will also be responsible to God for. Then it moves toward injustices. I wonder what injustices irk you most. Not getting credit for that which you're due, politicking, when people are politicking at work to push you out, or maybe birth defects. One of my colleagues at Singapore Bible College has had 3 children, each of which has ended up paralyzed through a neurological disease. Does that seem just? Maybe simple things like people who cut in line irk you, or maybe you feel that your family background is unjust because you did not have the privileges that some other people have had. How does injustice make you feel? Do you feel angry? Do you feel vengeful? Sometimes we feel withdrawn when we see injustices. We have different responses. So what should you do when life is unfair? It's a pretty relevant question for us, and this is what Solomon answers in this chapter as well. He does say to recognize that you will give an account to God. And he's saying here that whatever that injustice is, it's going to affect you. You will give an account to God for how you respond to that injustice. It's a good reminder for us. But he also says, enjoy life now. Sometimes people are so irked about injustice that they never really enjoy life. And the reality is death is going to come, so I think the natural response that we should have is to be people who really enjoy life. Life does not all have to be fair for us to enjoy it. So what should we do when life's unfair? I think basically what he's saying at the end of chapter 3 is account to God and enjoy life. As we get into chapter 4, he begins talking about those who just work excessively. I call it workaholic woes. And he answers the question, why avoid being a workaholic? There's a lot of wisdom here. And essentially what he says are 5 woes of those who work too hard, who are not able to balance work and rest, and their lives are just filled with always stuff to do. They're human doings rather than human beings. He says that they have no comforters, they have no rest, they have no beneficiaries because they work so hard they don't get married and have children. They have no friends. And then lastly, they really have no followers. They end up living a pretty lonely life. This is a great amount of wisdom here that tells us to work at not being a workaholic. Right? That's, I think, essentially the main idea of chapter 4. As we get into chapter 5, the focus continues on our work, but it shows how our work relates to honoring God. And I believe this is something that all of us struggle with in terms of how we worship God. Do you struggle with worshiping God? I think you do. I certainly do. So how can we honor God? What are the ingredients of a true reverence for God? Well, he says to honor God in your worship. Guard your steps when you go to the house of God, he says. Go near to listen rather than offer the sacrifice of fools who don't know their due wrong. And then he talks about something we probably don't think about, and that is to honor God in your vows in verses 4 to 7. When you make a vow to God, do not delay in fulfilling it. He has no pleasure in fools. Fulfill your vow. These are 2 things that are really worthy of our consideration. Honor God in your worship and your vows. And that's good for us to heed, don't you think? In chapter 6, we see a shift here from what he had talked about previously. We're still talking about this idea of why we should both enjoy life and fear God. And he's told us that life is fleeting. That's a great reason to enjoy life and fear God. And work is fleeting. That's a great reason to enjoy life and fear God. But now we see that wisdom is fleeting as well. Wisdom doesn't last. Even having the greatest discernment won't necessarily extend your life. And so what should you do in response? Certainly seek wisdom. But even the one who finds the most wisdom still has a wisdom that's transitory. And so he or she needs to enjoy life and fear God. So that's Solomon's bringing us here now to this third way that work and wisdom don't last. And we find here the focus is from man's humanity to man's hands to man's head. And here there's a lot to talk about ignorance. Oh, we all want wisdom. We may not think that we want it. I think every person truly does want it, even though it's not pursued by many. But that's going to come from trusting God's plan for our lives. And so I think the question that's raised here, why should we trust God's plan for our lives, is answered here in this section. And he says, first of all, God has planned all events and he won't change them. And I believe we're moving to a new section here in chapter 6, verse 10, where the focus shifts from work over to wisdom. Whatever exists has already been named, and what man is has been known. No man can contend with one who's stronger than he. The more words, the less meaning, and how does that profit anyone? For who knows what is good for a man in life, there's ignorance, during the few and meaningless days he passes through like a shadow. Who can tell him what will happen under the sun after he's gone? And of course the obvious answer is no one. No one can tell us what life's going to be like next year. God has planned for these things, though, and he's not going to change them. So in a sense, we're wise to rejoice in our ignorance. He also says, we don't know why easy and tough times come our way, as he moves on into chapter 7. In fact, he starts talking about this, about funerals. I read this at my father's funeral. A good name is better than fine perfume, and the day of death is better than the day of birth. It's better to go to a house of mourning than to a house of feasting, for death is the destiny of every man, and the living should take it to heart. Wow. It's better to be at a funeral than a feast? Yes. Because that's where we're going to end up. And it's good to consider now and live now in light of the end. So why should we trust in God's plan? He's basically saying God's plan is unchanging and you are ignorant of it. But you can trust in God's plan even though you're ignorant of it. In fact, doesn't that take more trust? To trust the Lord's will even though you can't figure it out? That's true trust. That's basically what he's saying here in the first part of Ecclesiastes 7. He gives other signs of real wisdom in chapter 7, verse 15 and beyond. I like what Roy Zook says about this. Biblical wisdom includes the art of being skillful and successful in one's relationships and responsibilities in life. An individual is successful as he directs his life in accord with God's divine design, his plans for the world. We often think of wisdom as not being relational, but wisdom is truly relational. The wise man will know how to deal with people in his life. And what are the qualities of that wisdom? He gives some of those qualities. He says wisdom is balanced. So avoid the extremes of depending on righteousness and living in sin. He says wisdom is strong. Avoid the weakness from blindness to your own faults. And then he says also wisdom is insightful. Avoid thinking you have all the answers, but still show insight. So I think he's essentially saying wisdom is balanced, it's strong, and it's insightful. Doesn't that make you want to have wisdom? So is wisdom balancing you or guarding you from extremes in your life? Or do you see everything as black and white, right and wrong? Are you gaining strength? Is your wisdom keeping you stable in your life? Or do you find your life just going up and down all the time? If you're up and down all the time, chances are you need God's wisdom. And does your life demonstrate insight? Ask yourself, is wisdom clearing my mind to see reality? I mean, do you live in reality? Or do you live in your own reality, which we all know, of course, is not reality? Because God alone sees reality correctly. In chapter 8, we see submission and joy. There's quite a relationship between the two. How should we respond to authority? This is something many of us struggle with. God's authority and people's authority. Authority to both God and man. And Solomon says, if you're going to be wise, obey authorities due to the many advantages. And we don't have the time to enumerate all those advantages, but you can read those in the first 9 verses of chapter 8. And then he says, we punish the wrong people. And so it puzzles us. You ever thought about who we actually punish? We don't punish bad people a lot of times. What we do is we end up punishing good people instead. And that is quite perplexing. And sometimes we get really disillusioned about all this. So he says, enjoy life and submit to God, even though he won't tell us his reasons. He doesn't tell us why he allows these things to happen. So what does he say? So I recommend having fun, because there's nothing better for people in this world than to eat, drink, and enjoy life. That way they experience some happiness along with all the hard work God gives them under the sun. That doesn't sound like someone who's spoiling the fun, does it? He's telling us basically, humbly submit to man and God, and you'll get joy. I find in my own life, the more humility I have in my life, the more joy I also have. And the more ability I have to submit to authority, the more blessed I am. So where do you need to submit to authority? Where do you need to recognize your limited understanding? Solomon's quite helpful to us in that regard. When we get to the next chapter, we see in chapter 9 that the future is uncertain. And how do most people deal with their uncertain future? Some deal with it with materialism or hedonism or humanism or fatalism. Well, those are not good. So how should we respond to an uncertain future? He talks about our reality and our response here in chapter 9, verses 1 to 10. Here's the reality. You want to know your future? Here's your future. Your uncertain future includes certain death. Isn't that comforting? You want to know some things that are just absolutely certain about your future, right? We all do. Death is one of those. You can see published mortality rates where the lines are going up and down. I find this quite curious, and it looks so detailed, until I realized here's actually the world mortality rate. No matter what year you're talking about, 100% of the people die. There's your mortality rate. It's 100%. It's only a matter of time. And since you'll die, enjoy life and work hard right now. Find that sense of balance. So he says, so go ahead, eat your food with joy and drink your wine with a happy heart, for God approves of this. Or, sum it up in the main idea, since you don't know the future, work hard and enjoy life. Do both. Don't deprive yourself of joy because of work, but don't work so much you deprive yourself of any joy. Chapter 10 leads us to the question, why doesn't wisdom always lead to success? You would think that those who are wise are always going to be successful. Frankly, Solomon is a great example of someone who was wise but not ultimately successful. He says that because life is unfair. If you expect life to be fair, you're really going to be miserable. And to answer this question, why doesn't wisdom always lead to success? Sometimes unfair things happen to us and we don't succeed in those areas where we may have been actually very honorable. In that sense, also life is uncertain. The unreliable nature of life hinders wisdom. And we really need God's wisdom. So the exhortation here is don't trust wisdom. Trust God. God himself is the one that will give us true wisdom. We also need to know how to deal with fools. Oh, you know what I'm talking about. We all know a fool. In fact, we've all been a fool. I can speak with experience about foolishness because I've done foolish things. So have you. But how should we deal with a fool when someone's being foolish with us? Well, he says, the speech and the actions of a fool are destructive. And so be careful. And don't even privately criticize foolish authorities because they may find out. So basically, he tells us in chapter 10, 12 to 20, don't criticize your foolish leader. As some have said, it takes little size to criticize. Chapter 11 talks more about the uncertainty of the future and how it affects you, or how should it affect you. And here he advises us to give generously and invest wisely. He says, cast your bread upon the waters, for after many days you'll find it again. Send your grain across the seas, and in time profits will flow back to you, is another way that this has been translated. But divide your investments among many projects, for you do not know what risks might lie ahead. Don't hoard, but give and invest, since you don't know the future. Work hard due to your uncertain future, but give generously, invest wisely, and work hard. All three of them, since you don't know your future. This is how we deal with a life when we're ignorant. So how should we both enjoy life and fear God? We should realize that life is fleeting, work is fleeting, wisdom is fleeting. And when we get then to the end of the book, we see that youth is fleeting as well. Young people aren't young for very much of their lives. And in this last section of the book, we see the focus on man's heart, especially when we're young. It's a great time to work on your heart because you, however old you are, you will grow older. And so we see an exhortation here how to enjoy your youth. And I wonder if that applies to you. Are you a youth? How would you know? What stage of life are we really talking about youth? Well, one person says the 3 stages for women are stage 1, annoying her dad. Stage 2, annoying her husband. And stage 3, annoying her son-in-law. So if you get to stage 3, you know you're not a youth anymore, right? That's a pretty sad evaluation of life, don't you think, about women? There's 3 stages for men as well. Stage 1, you believe in Santa. Stage 2, you don't believe. Stage 3, you are Santa. I don't know how many stages life has, but perhaps it does have 3. And I'm thinking of the first 30 years as youth, the next 30 years as midlife, and if you're like the privileged, you could live to 90, at least in good health. But what do you do to focus on that first stage? How should youth pursue their lives? What should they pursue? He says basically focus on 2 pursuits. The youth ought to enjoy life now before judgment and death comes. Hey, doesn't that sound like something most youth would really be receptive to? To enjoy life? They actually make that as a goal for many of them anyway. But it's nice to know that the Bible tells us to do it. He says, light is sweet and it pleases the eye to see the sun. It's great. Enjoy the sun. Verse 9, be happy, young man, while you are young. Let your heart give you joy in the days of your youth. Follow the ways of your heart. Wow, that sounds pretty good. Live each day with joy. Why? Because Judgment and death will come. And this day might be your last. And he also says, honor God as creator before you grow old and die. Respect the Lord as a young person, because soon you will be elderly. The way chapter 12 says it is, remember also your creator in the days of your youth. Don't let the excitement of youth cause you to forget your creator. Honor God. So honor your creator now before you hit the limits of old age. And finally, when we get to the end of the book, we have some great wisdom here about the theme, beginning again, chapter 12, verse 8, the theme of life being fleeting, and then also the authority that we need to live by being God's word. Not only was the teacher wise, chapter 12, verse 9 says, but he also imparted knowledge to the people. He pondered and searched out and set in order many proverbs. The teacher searched to find just the right words, and what he wrote was upright and true. And what did he say about those words? Well, he said to make sure that of making many books there's no end, and much study wears you out. So what should you do in response? He concludes by saying, respect and obey God, because this applies to everyone. That's the whole story. Here now is my final conclusion. Fear God and obey his commandments, Solomon says. But he gives us the reason why in the final verse of the book. That's the whole story. Here's the final conclusion. Fear God and obey his commands, for this is everyone's duty. He says, verse 14, the final verse, for God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. Said differently, respect and obey God to finish well. So, do you want to have a life that you enjoy and that also fears God? Then I would sum up the book this way. Well, everything is fleeting, so be intentional to enjoy life and fear God. What we've seen in this study is that life is fleeting, work is fleeting, wisdom is fleeting, and youth is fleeting. So evaluate your own pursuit. What are you really pursuing? May I encourage you to pursue God. Fear God. Keep his commandments. How are you going to keep his commandments unless you know them? Did you know that if you read the Bible 5 minutes a day, you would be giving God 1/288th portion of your day? Do you think God is worth such a small portion? I made a commitment many years ago to read the Bible at least 5 minutes a day. I made that commitment over 40 years ago. One of the best commitments I've ever made in my life. If you're struggling with how to do that and a plan to do that, go to bible-reading.com and it'll give you some help. Fear God and keep his commandments.